What is up, everyone? Welcome to A Sum of Two Buses. Today's episode, we're going to nerd on some multiband dynamics with the band Veers. What's multiband dynamics? Wow, we're not wasting any time today, are we? Multiband dynamics is the ability to divide the source into numerous bands, and each band has its own dedicated processor with its own independent controls, such as attack, release, ratios, and even makeup gain. Okay, so what's dynamic EQ? Well, dynamic EQ is a threshold-dependent EQ. Think of it like a compressor. But instead of bringing the noise floor up and reducing the dynamic range, a dynamic EQ cuts a certain frequency by a determined amount only when that specific band hits its threshold. Why are these processors so important? Well, multiband compressors and dynamic EQs are what I would consider essential for getting a great vocal sound. And having a great vocal sound is what makes a great mix to the average listener. Someone told me years ago, and it will always be true, you could have the best mix in the world, but if you can't hear the singer, it sounds like shit. So today, I figured we would talk about the two multiband processors I use the most. So let's start by chatting a little bit about the F6 by Waves. The F6 is a fantastic dynamic EQ. In the Soundgrid world, it has no latency, and it also seems to be somewhat lean on CPU usage. It's pretty straightforward on its features and very user-friendly, and it's jam-packed full of features that makes it a very creative plugin. If you look, it has two dedicated filters with adjustable slope that can go from 6 dB to 24 dB per octave. And you could switch each one of these bands from stereo mode to MS mode, which allows you to only focus on either the mid or the side information of whatever your source is. In addition to MS processing, you can have each one of these bands independently sidechain within the MS modes. That really opens up some crazy ideas for sidechaining. And if that wasn't enough, the plugin also has a mix control and it has a sidechain with control. Definitely a Swiss Army knife of plugins. Now let's talk about the DYN8. In full disclosure, it did take a little while to get used to. It's extremely powerful, and it too is jam-packed with a lot of features, especially for an onboard multiband processor. In the DLive platform, you can have up to 64 instances, and you can insert it pretty much anywhere. The DYN8 is a multiband beast. 4 bands of multiband compression into 4 bands of dynamic EQ. The multiband compression part of this plugin has a lot of built-in tone control that I'm still learning to this day. By tone control, I'm talking about the master knee control for each one of the bands in the multiband compression setting, right here. It also has a master slope control for each one of these bands that can switch from 6 dB to 18 to 24 dB per octave. And then there's the master style control. Think of them as attack and release profiles. There are 6 of them, and 4 of them have fixed attack and release times. Now, I generally like to have control over my attack and release times, so I generally stick with the RMS and the peak profiles. The RMS setting feels a little grabbier and overall a little slower, and the peak profile reacts a lot faster, similar to the differences found on the stock channel compressor between the manual RMS and the manual peak. The external sidechain option for all 8 bands in the DYN8 is definitely one of my top loves of the desk. You could pretty much choose any source as a sidechain, from inputs to matrices, and independently choose to engage this on any or all of the bands. And with the split or the wide option, this gives you control over the width for the detector of the band. Overall, a pretty great sounding processor. It just takes a little time to get used to. Now let's talk about the DYN8 section of this plugin. Like I said before, each band of this EQ has the same sidechain options as the multiband compression section. You have 2 attack and release modes for each band. You have a fast 9 and a standard 9. Both modes are pretty musical. You also have an above and below option for each band, which can make the dynamic EQ go from cutting to upward expansion. Now, I won't lie, setting this part of the DYN8 up takes a little getting used to as well. I still have a very crude way of approaching this. I tend to choose my frequency by dragging my finger usually, then crank down on the threshold till you see the metering. And then I turn down the gain of that particular band until I get the desired amount of dynamic EQ cutting. Now you can further adjust your threshold depending on what you need. Now, if you're doing this offline, there's also a very destructive way of doing this. You could select your frequency, crank the threshold all the way down, and then grab the gain and pull it down, and then readjust your threshold to get the desired amount of dynamic EQ. But be careful, this is super destructive, so you shouldn't do this during a show or sound check. Today's audio demonstration is from a killer rock band out of LA called Veers. These dudes rock. Andy, their singer, and I go way back. They just started doing these live sessions on YouTube from their rehearsal space, so be sure to check them out. There's going to be a link at the end of this video. Let's get started, shall we? We'll be starting with vocals, and I have 3 scenes set up. That way we can A/B all of these processors back to back. The last of the 3 is a bypass. Normally my go-to for vocals is an F6, so let's start there. The next step will be an interesting one. I wanted to see if I could achieve the same sound that I get with an F6 with the DYN8. I know, apples to oranges, but I thought it would be interesting to say the least. So I set both of these processors up to be my source of EQ and multiband control. And like I said, the last scene will be an all bypass. All right, let's start with the F6.
Slither around in a suit that never fits you. I wish you'd throw it away. Never prone to our problems, just a madman. A man that still coats to save. Slither around in a suit that never fits you. I wish you'd throw it away. Never prone to our problems, just a madman. A man that still coats to save. Slither around in a suit that never fits you. I wish you'd throw it away. Never prone to our problems, just a madman. A man that still coats to save.
Pretty wild, right? I believe multiband dynamic control is essential for getting a great vocal sound. Did I mention that before? Especially in the live realm when you're working with very powerful singers very close to the mic. Let's move to something opposite of the spectrum. The next demonstration will be looking at multiband dynamic control on a kick. Now this particular kick had a lot more resonance and a lot more attack because it was a kick-out mic. In my mix, I used the parallel compressed channel as a source of my attack, and I used the other channel as a source for my punch. Now, I usually default to using a DYN8 on my kick, so that's where we'll start. Like in the previous demonstration, I thought it would be fun to see if I can get the F6 to do what the DYN8 does. And yes, I'm aware, apples to oranges. Now I set up a third scene, which will be my attempt to try to achieve the same sound as the F6 and the DYN8 with only channel EQ and compression. Why would you do that? I just thought it would be fun to see how close I can get to our multiband friends with conventional channel EQ and compression. The fourth scene is everything bypassed, so no fun. Now the last scene is what my channel actually sounds like in the mix. Because remember, it's not about what a channel sounds like soloed. It's all about how the pieces fit together. All right, let's check out what our DYN8's doing. All right, the F6. All right, just EQ comp. All bypass. it's pretty wild how different my kick sounds from the mix than actually being soloed. It's all about putting the pieces together. We can safely say using these powerful multi-band tools can really polish the overall sound and help us sculpt things with much more precision than just EQ and compression. Did I mention it's essential for getting a great vocal sound? Let's also think about singers with a very, very broad range. When they sing in a higher register, it might make you feel like you need to cut a little bit more high mids to cut some of the harshness, and leave a little bit more lows in the vocal to keep it warm. But then they switch to a lower range. You might want or need to do the exact opposite of that when they go to the lower register, like adding a little bit highs or high mids and cutting some of the boominess in their vocal. Well, having things like dynamic EQs and multi-band compressors can really help control the overall spectrum of the vocalist. So whatever range they sing in, their vocal can sound full and pleasant to the ears. Be sure to tune in next episode when we talk about the basics of automation. Well, that's it for this episode of A Sum of Two Buses. If you dug it, please like, please share, please subscribe. Until next time, take care and be safe.